In the summer of 1966, a man looking at a map of South Vietnam would not have lingered long on Phuoc Thi province. It sat southeast of Saigon, relatively small, relatively quiet, not a place where grand offensives were being planned or major battles anticipated. It was not the Mekong Delta, swarming with Viet Cong infrastructure. It was not the Central Highlands, where North Vietnamese Army regulars were massing. On paper, Phuoc Thi was a secondary theater, a backwater. That assessment was dangerously wrong. What the maps did not immediately communicate was the province's underlying strategic geometry. Phuoc Thi controlled access to a network of coastal landing points along the South China Sea, natural ingress routes that could theoretically support a seaborne resupply of communist forces operating in the south. More critically, the province contained dense jungle corridors that served as arterial routes for Viet Cong logistics, pathways through which weapons, ammunition, food, and personnel moved southward under triple canopy cover, largely invisible to aerial reconnaissance. The jungle was not simply terrain. It was infrastructure. 3 major Viet Cong formations operated in and around the province. The D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, the 274th Regiment, and the 275th Regiment of the 5th Viet Cong Division. Combined, these units represented a significant and experienced insurgent force, battle-hardened, deeply embedded in the local population, and intimately familiar with every paddy field, rubber plantation, and jungle track in the region. Into this environment, in May 1966, the Australian 1st Task Force arrived and established its base at Nui Dat, a low hill rising from the jungle floor approximately 12 kilometers north of the coastal town of Baria. The decision to establish operations at Nui Dat was itself a statement of intent. The Australians did not build a fortress. They did not construct a sprawling, heavily fortified complex in the American model. Those vast installations with their PX stores, helicopter pads, concrete bunkers, and thousands of support personnel. Nui Dat was spare, functional, deliberately minimalist. A base designed not to project permanence through infrastructure, but to project presence through constant operational tempo. This distinction is essential. It defines everything that followed. The American approach to Vietnam, at least in its dominant form under General William Westmoreland, was built around the concept of search and destroy. Large formations, delivered by helicopter, would sweep into enemy-controlled territory, engage the enemy in combat, inflict maximum casualties, and then extract. The philosophy was fundamentally episodic. The Americans would pass through the jungle, count their kills, and depart. The jungle would remain. The enemy would regroup. The Australians understood this dynamic and rejected it, not through arrogance, but through the accumulated experience of counterinsurgency operations in Malaya, where the British Commonwealth had spent more than a decade learning how to dismantle a rural insurgency from the inside. The principles developed during the Malayan emergency were seared into Australian military doctrine. Dominate the ground through persistent presence, not temporary incursion. Patrol constantly. Deny the enemy freedom of movement. Never allow the jungle to belong exclusively to the guerrilla. The Americans passed through the jungle. One Australian officer later wrote in his operational journal, "We stayed inside it." The practical expression of this philosophy was the Relentless patrol program radiating outward from Nui Dat. Day and night, small Australian patrols, typically 4 to 10 men, moved through the surrounding jungle in a continuous cycle of reconnaissance, ambush, and intelligence gathering. They slept in the jungle. They ate in the jungle. They did not return to base for hot meals and clean beds between operations. They remained in the environment they were tasked to control. The effect on Viet Cong operations was cumulative and measurable. Supply movements became more difficult. Local commanders reported ambushes on routes that had previously been considered safe. The psychological pressure on VC cadres was constant and grinding. There was no respite, no safe corridor, no predictable window of reduced Australian activity. The erosion was slow, but it was relentless. By mid-1966, the senior leadership of the Viet Cong formations operating in Phuoc Thi had reached a strategic decision point. The Australian presence at Nui Dat was not simply inconvenient. It was systematically degrading their operational capacity. Supply failures were increasing. Ambush losses were mounting. The ability to move freely through terrain they had controlled for years was being steadily eroded. The Australians, with their infuriatingly patient patrol doctrine, were winning the war of attrition on the ground. The VC commander's conclusion was clear. The base at Nui Dat could not be simply endured. It had to be neutralized. But neutralizing a well-fortified military base through direct assault was not realistic. What the Viet Cong needed was not a frontal attack. They needed a mechanism to draw the Australians out of their base and into a killing ground of the enemy's choosing. A place where terrain, weather, and numbers could be leveraged to destroy an Australian element large enough to fundamentally undermine the task force's operational credibility and, ideally, force its withdrawal. A mortar attack on Nui Dat would be the bait. The Australian response, as any competent analyst of their doctrine could predict, would be a patrol dispatched to locate and destroy the attacking force. That patrol would walk into something it was not expecting. The trap was being assembled. On the night of the 17th of August, 1966, Nui Dat base was struck. Mortar rounds began falling inside the perimeter in the darkness, a sharp, deliberate bombardment that lasted long enough to cause damage and alarm, but not so prolonged as to invite an immediate, overwhelming response. The attack was precise in its intent. Create the conditions that would trigger an Australian patrol the following morning. Cause enough disruption to justify a response. Not enough to invite annihilation. The effect inside the base was significant but contained. Several soldiers were wounded. Equipment was damaged. More critically, from a psychological standpoint, the message was unmistakable. The Viet Cong had located the base, had the range, and were prepared to demonstrate it. The Australian command reacted exactly as the enemy's planners had anticipated. The doctrine demanded it. A mortar attack against the base from a fixed position required a patrol to sweep the likely firing locations, identify enemy sign, and, if possible, make contact and destroy the attacking force before it could regroup and strike again. To do otherwise would have been to concede the initiative to the enemy. That was not the Australian way. Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, received its orders on the morning of the 18th. The company's commander was Major Harry Smith, a 33-year-old career officer of notable composure and professional reputation. Smith was not a man given to theatrical flourishes or empty bravado. His leadership style was methodical, analytical, and deeply grounded in tactical awareness. He understood, from years of training and operational experience, that the jungle did not reward carelessness. Delta Company mustered 108 men, organized into 3 rifle platoons and a command element. They would move east from Nui Dat toward the Long Tan rubber plantation and the surrounding terrain, sweeping for evidence of the mortar cruise. The operation was categorized as a routine follow-up patrol, a standard task, not the kind of mission that generated anxiety among experienced soldiers. Within the company, the mood reflected that assessment. This was a patrol, not an assault, a sweep, not a battle. The men were experienced, well-trained, and professionally confident. They moved out of Nui Dat in good order. What none of them knew, what no intelligence assessment, no aerial photograph, no agent report had yet revealed, was that they were not sweeping for a mortar crew. They were walking toward 2 full Viet Cong regiments. The 274th and 275th Regiments of the 5th VC Division had moved into position under the cover of the rubber plantation and surrounding jungle in the days preceding the mortar attack. Their total strength in the immediate operational area is estimated by post-battle assessments at somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 men. Hardened, disciplined, and operating on familiar terrain, they had positioned themselves in a deliberate tactical formation designed to envelop and destroy any Australian element that followed the bait into their zone of control. Delta Company, with 108 men, was moving directly into that formation. The morning passed without incident. Patrols moved through relatively open terrain, finding nothing of immediate significance. The rubber plantation appeared passive, the long, straight rows of trees standing in their characteristic geometry, casting lines of shadow across the red laterite soil. Nothing moved. Nothing announced itself. But in military history, silence before contact is not the absence of danger. It is the final moment before the door closes. The Long Tan rubber plantation was, by physical description, deceptively inviting terrain. Unlike the dense, suffocating chaos of primary jungle, where visibility collapsed to single-digit meters and movement was measured in hours per kilometer, the plantation offered relative openness. The rubber trees were planted in orderly rows, their trunks rising uniformly from the red earth, spaced in a manner that permitted a man to see 50, perhaps 100 meters in certain directions. But this perception of openness was fundamentally misleading. The straight tree lines, while eliminating the visual claustrophobia of primary jungle, created a different tactical problem. They imposed rigid corridors of visibility while simultaneously masking lateral movement. A force moving through the plantation could see forward and backward along a tree row, but remained largely blind to activity in the adjacent rows. An enemy force moving perpendicular to your axis of advance, sliding laterally through the plantation, could position itself within 50 meters of your flank without being seen. More critically, the plantation's drainage characteristics were severe. The ground was flat, saturated, and offered negligible runoff. When rain fell, it accumulated rapidly. Shortly after 15-30 hours, the first contact was made. A small enemy element was encountered, rounds were exchanged, and the enemy withdrew in a controlled manner, not fleeing, but pulling back in organized fashion. To a patrol commander, a withdrawing enemy presents an instinctive tactical opportunity. Pursue, maintain pressure, prevent reorganization. 11 Platoon, under Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, moved forward in pursuit. The withdrawal was not a retreat. It was a lure. Then the monsoon arrived. It came without the gradual escalation of a typical tropical shower. In the way that the Vietnamese monsoon could operate at its most extreme, the sky simply collapsed. Rain fell not in drops, but in sheets, dense, horizontal curtains of water that reduced visibility to near zero within seconds. The ground, already saturated, began to flood. Water streamed between the rows of rubber trees in rivulets that deepened with every passing minute. The red laterite soil, compressed by years of rubber cultivation, rejected the water rather than absorbing it, turning the plantation floor into a shallow, adhesive swamp. Radio communications, already compressed by the plantation's micro-terrain, became erratic. The rain generated a constant, overwhelming noise that made voice communication at tactical distances almost impossible. Hand signals disappeared in the reduced visibility. The ability to coordinate between elements, critical in any contact, was being systematically degraded. And it was in this moment, as the monsoon overwhelmed the senses and collapsed communication, that the full scale of what lay ahead of them began to reveal itself. Small contacts escalated. Enemy fire intensified. The number of muzzle flashes visible through the rain suggested not a squad, not a platoon, but a force of significant and alarming size. 11 Platoon was in contact with the leading edge of a regiment. The trap had closed. What followed in the long tan rubber plantation on the afternoon and evening of the 18th of August, 1966, was one of the most tactically remarkable engagements in the history of modern counterinsurgency warfare. It was remarkable not for the numbers involved, 108 Australians against an estimated force that outnumbered them by a ratio approaching 20-1, but for the manner in which those 108 men responded. Not with panic, not with fragmentation, not with the gradual psychological collapse that disproportionate odds and catastrophic conditions typically produce in any military unit in history. They did not break. The full weight of the 274th Regiment's assault came at 11 Platoon first. The enemy's initial approach had the character of a controlled tactical probe, fire delivered with precision, designed to assess the Australian position, identify key weapon emplacements, and determine the shape of the defensive perimeter. Within minutes, however, the nature of the attack escalated dramatically. Human wave assaults, signaled by bugles, a tactical communication method used by VC and NVA units to coordinate large-scale infantry movements, began washing through the rubber trees in successive waves. Dozens of enemy soldiers moving at speed through the straight tree lines, using the geometry of the plantation itself as their movement corridor. Lieutenant Gordon Sharp's 11 Platoon held. They absorbed the first wave with controlled, disciplined fire, every man shooting at assessed targets, not firing blindly into the rain. Fire discipline under those conditions is not instinctive. It is the product of training so deeply embedded that it functions independently of fear. Sharp's men were performing exactly as their doctrine demanded, even as the scale of what was bearing down on them became catastrophically apparent. Then Gordon Sharp was killed. The loss of a platoon commander in the middle of a firefight against overwhelming odds is, in the cold mathematics of military psychology, frequently the moment a unit begins to unravel. The chain of command is disrupted. Confidence in survival is shaken. In untrained or poorly led units, the instinct for individual self-preservation begins to override collective tactical discipline. Sergeant Bob Buick assumed command. There was no ceremony to the transition, no moment of hesitation visible to the enemy. Buick assessed his situation with the clinical focus of a professional soldier who had been trained for exactly this eventuality. His platoon was isolated. Enemy fire was intensifying. The remaining rifle sections were under assault from multiple directions simultaneously. Ammunition consumption had already begun to accelerate at a rate that would soon become critical. He held the line. Meanwhile, Major Harry Smith, commanding Delta Company from his position further back in the plantation, was engaged in a tactical problem of immense complexity. His 3 platoons, 10, 11, and 12, were increasingly separated by the combination of terrain, monsoon, and enemy pressure. Communications were intermittent and fragmentary. The scale of the enemy force he was confronting was only becoming clear through the velocity and weight of the fire being poured into his positions. The operational calculus was brutally simple. If the company fragmented, if individual platoons attempted independent withdrawal, each element would be isolated and destroyed in detail by an enemy force large enough to pursue and overwhelm multiple separated groups simultaneously. The only viable course of action was to consolidate, maintain cohesion, and hold until relief could arrive. Consolidation under fire, against a numerically superior enemy, in zero-visibility monsoon conditions, is a maneuver that tests every level of military professionalism simultaneously. It requires section commanders to move their men under fire. It requires platoon sergeants to maintain directional awareness when landmarks have been obliterated by rain and darkness. It requires individual soldiers to trust the collective system absolutely, to move when ordered, in the direction ordered, even when every primitive instinct screams otherwise. Delta Company executed it. The Viet Cong assault continued. Bugle calls signaled successive wave attacks. The enemy's tactical approach was disciplined and sophisticated, not the disorganized mob charge that popular history sometimes attributes to VC infantry assaults. These were coordinated, phased attacks designed to probe the perimeter, identify weak points, and concentrate force at the point of maximum vulnerability. The VC commanders understood that if they could fragment the Australian perimeter, separate it into disconnected pockets of resistance, the outcome was mathematically predetermined. A critical tactical development complicated the enemy's plans in a way that would prove decisive. The Viet Cong assault force had deliberately moved their forward elements to within 30 to 40 meters of the Australian perimeter. This was not accidental. It was a calculated tactical decision designed to neutralize the Australian artillery advantage. If enemy infantry was within 40 meters of Australian positions, supporting artillery fire became extremely difficult to employ without inflicting casualties on the men it was meant to protect. At Nui Dat, the guns of 103 Field Battery, Royal Australian Artillery, had been firing in support since the earliest stages of the engagement. Shell after shell was being walked toward the plantation with lethal precision. But now, with the enemy pressed intimately close to the Australian perimeter, each fire mission required the forward observer, Warrant Officer Kevin Miller, directing fire from inside the contact, to accept an unprecedented level of risk. Ammunition across the Australian perimeter was running to critical levels. Individual riflemen had begun to consolidate magazines, redistributing remaining rounds to the men most heavily engaged. Belt-fed ammunition for the M60 machine guns, the primary direct-fire suppression weapon in each platoon, was being fed from diminishing stocks. The bodies of the fallen lay in the mud beside the positions of the men still fighting. The perimeter was shrinking under the weight of successive enemy assaults. And still they did not break. The discipline visible in those positions, the controlled fire, the maintained formation, the refusal to fragment under assault conditions that had broken larger units in military history, was not the product of adrenaline or national mythology. It was the operational output of a training system and a command culture that had spent years building exactly this capacity. That capacity was about to be tested to its absolute limit,